Everybody, Nike here. I wanted to discuss a meta-level topic today, namely the long, slow death of the mirror comp and the last piece of the puzzle, which is Alacrity. To give a brief recap, a year ago the meta comp was 2 warriors, 2 druids, 2 chronos, and 4 DPS classes, which were usually Ellies. This is known as the mirror comp. Over time, the balance team has brought the Ellie more in line with the other classes, especially on small hitboxes, enabling the DPS slot to open up more considerably. Warrior banners extended to 10 players, and eventually the might stacking role was taken away from the warriors and given to the druids, as we'll see, which leaves the second warrior a bit redundant and not used in any groups. Druid spirits were recently changed to 10-man, and Grace of the Land was changed to a might stacking ability for 10 players, which removed the need for a second druid in most groups, allowing an extra DPS or a non-healer druid if you potentially wanted even more heals. The last relic of the mirror comp is the double chrono, which we're still stuck with. And there's a very important reason for that. It brings both Alacrity, which is a unique buff, and quickness in one package. Sure, Firebrand can stack quickness and some other boons. Renegade can give its group perma-Alacrity and bring some heals. But getting both buffs, Alacrity and quickness, in a single package is a role compression that we don't find anywhere else. With the nerf to distortion share, Alacrity is the sore thumb sticking out that keeps double chrono in the meta now and forever. Is there a way to change Alacrity so that the second chrono becomes unnecessary or unwanted without hurting everyone's play experience? Possibly. So when you nerf Weaver, for example, it hurts Weavers and Weaver players get upset. If ANET nerfed Alacrity, it affects everyone and everyone gets upset. So you can understand why this is a much more delicate issue than other changes to a class individually could normally be. If ANET simply deleted Alacrity, the fallout would be enormous because it wouldn't just be chrono players suffering. You can imagine the impact that it would have on Weaver players, for example. They would probably be just as mad as the chrono players, if not more. So Alacrity is a huge, huge concern that must be considered, and any change that people propose has to be taken very carefully. At the very most basic level, ANET could simply make Alacrity hit 10 players. I don't consider this to be a realistic solution. The buff to total raid DPS would be quite high, and it is almost certainly out of the question as a result of that. On the other end of the spectrum, ANET could simply delete Alacrity, or, as has been suggested by some, make Alacrity a personal buff for the Chronomancer only. As I touched on earlier, this would have fallout from other professions, so it would create an uproar in the community that would need to be managed extremely carefully. So there has to be some solution in the middle that works a bit better than either of those extremes. So there are plenty of options, of which I'm going to go over some of the more realistic ones that I've heard out there. But before I do, I should mention that at the most basic level, what Alacrity actually is. And Alacrity is actually 2 things. On one hand, it's a simple DPS increase. On the other hand, it's a quality of life increase. We can, without a doubt, quantify how much Alacrity benefits every class and every build. And roughly speaking, it works out to be between a 5 and 15% DPS boost, averaging about 10% depending on the profession and build. What's harder to quantify is the quality of life increase. For example, Alacrity might only be a 15% DPS boost for a Weaver, but playing a rotation with Alacrity compared to one without Alacrity is far more than a 15% quality of life and happiness improvement, and that is something that is very key to consider. So one possible solution is to simply nerf the power level of Alacrity. Right now it reduces cooldowns by 33%. Changing it to 15% or 10% would vastly reduce its power to the point where a Firebrand's personal DPS might outweigh the benefits of Alacrity in a very meaningful way. Additionally, it has been suggested that Alacrity could become a boon, which would vastly increase the uptime. Potentially as a boon, a single chrono could keep Alacrity on 10 players. In combination with a weaker version of Alacrity, like 15 or 10%, being able to keep it up on 10 players would be a nice compensation, and it sort of comes off as a fair solution. Another idea would be to vastly reduce the uptime of Alacrity. Remove Alacrity from the Shield Phantasm and replace it with some new functionality. Lower or remove the Alacrity from All's Well. Lower the Alacrity from Well of Recall. Make it such that, at best, Alacrity can be done in a burst for about 10 to 15 seconds per minute. As I said, to compensate for the low uptime, turbocharge it. Instead of a 33% cooldown, make it 100%. So it becomes a 10-second... So in that example, a 10-second cooldown would become a 5-second cooldown. Or perhaps you could even make it more powerful so that a 10-second cooldown becomes like a 2.5-second cooldown. Essentially, what I'm suggesting here is to turn it from a perma buff that gives a smallish benefit always to a bursty buff that gives a god tier benefit for the short time that it's up. Consider it like Glyph of Empowerment on steroids. It would be a very desirable buff, especially in fights with burst phases or ones that favor power classes. But it wouldn't be the sort of buff that you would plan to have up 24/7. It wouldn't be the sort of buff that you must ensure your group always has access to. In long sustained fights without burn phases or invuln phases, the DPS boost wouldn't actually be that high, and thus your team might favor a Firebrand who brings a personally higher DPS for a fight of that nature. One thing I do think that should be mentioned in sort of a compensation for the quality of life of making Alacrity from a perma buff to a short-term bursty buff would be to take the certain vital profession mechanics from other classes and make them make them a little bit better. So take the general cooldown, the global cooldown of the Weaver attunement swaps and make it from base 4 seconds to base 3 seconds. Make the cooldown of Hollowsmith Forge mode cooldown maybe 20% less. Make the cooldown of Berserk for Warrior maybe 20% less. Things that would feel really bad from a quality of life standpoint, if not even a huge DPS gain. I think that would go a long way towards appeasing the non-chrono players who would be affected from a quality of life standpoint. A final consideration I wanted to discuss is the impact on Chronomancer and chrono players. Is chrono currently fun to play? I think after the distortion nerf, a lot of chrono players would say that it feels pretty slow and robotic, and they could put their rotations on a macro and kind of AFK, which is an exaggeration, but I think there's some truth to that as well. Personally, I don't think chrono is particularly engaging to play at the moment, and worst of all, we have to bring 2 of them to most fights. Unlike, say, Ventari Renegade, Chrono Alacrity is very fire and forget. Chrono can achieve a very high uptime of Alacrity simply by summoning 3 Shield Phantasms and going to sleep if you wanted to. Renegade requires tablet micro, or at least the players to respect their position relative to the tablet. This is just one example of an area that makes playing Chrono feel less rewarding than comparable classes. If ANET does do something to tweak Alacrity, they need to take a deep look at how Chrono plays in raids and the fun factor involved. Perhaps that means revamping Phantasms to be a bit more skill-based or active in their use, rather than something you summon and forget about. With a potential reduction in power level of Alacrity, more personal DPS or even more utility can be added to the Chrono or base Mesmer, and a buff to the non-Alacrity, non-quickness kit of the base Mesmer or Chrono could be implemented in a pretty great way as compensation. So anyway, I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts. Do you want double Chrono to go? Do you want it to stay forever? How would you change Alacrity, if assuming you did want it to change? And am I ignoring a bigger balance issue at the moment, or is this the biggest issue out there? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching.